Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle McClure. I'm founder of Huji Marketing, and it's been my passion in life to support business founders in succeeding and reaching their ambitions. And today I am delighted to be joined by Chris Hurd, who I closely follow on LinkedIn, and you should too, because his business journey with Firstbase fascinates me. So Chris has established himself as a thought leader in the remote work industry. He provides valuable insights and pioneers solutions that address the unique challenges that are faced by remote workers and their employers. So Firstbase, the company that Chris founded, offers an all-in-one platform for remote workers to set up, manage, and retrieve equipment. And this innovative approach has really positioned Firstbase as a critical player in the remote work landscape, especially as remote work has really gained prominence, obviously, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the platform simplifies the logistics of remote work, ensuring employees have the necessary tools and equipment to be productive from anywhere, which we know is so important. So Chris has constantly advocated for the benefits of remote work, highlighting key advantages such as increased productivity, I can vouch for that one, better work-life balance, and broader access to great talent. And his insights and predictions about the future of work have been featured in some really top media outlets like Forbes, TechCrunch, and Business Insider. And one of the most remarkable aspects of Chris's journey as a UK founder hailing from Scotland, like myself, is how he has successfully attracted significant investment from US-based venture capital firms, including Andreessen Horowitz, one of the Silicon Valley's leading firms. So navigating the complex landscape of transatlantic investment, Chris has demonstrated a deep understanding of both the US and the UK investment ecosystems, making Firstbase obviously a really attractive proposition for investors. So today we are so lucky to delve into Chris's experiences and insights on that front, his strategies that he's used to secure that investment, his vision for the future of remote work, and we're also going to uncover some really practical advice for other founders out there who are looking to navigate the investment landscape and build successful ventures. So hopefully I haven't inflated your brain too much there, Chris. Hello, welcome. How are you doing today? Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule as a business founder for our little chat. How are you doing today? What's your world looking like?
World's busy. Yeah, we have a lot of things going on as the world, I think, continues to change, like you sort of touched on in the introduction. And yeah, trying to make hay while the sun shines in Scotland.
A rare day. The sun is shining in Scotland. So let's start off with a little bit about when you secured funding for Firstbase. What were the initial steps that you took to secure that funding, and how did your approach sort of evolve over time?
Mm. Yeah, I think it was a long journey. We started off building a very different business, financial technology company, founded that in March 2018. And I think at that point was very naive to the way the venture capital world worked. And I think because I never really had a network, I didn't know anyone in that space. I didn't really know many founders who had raised money from investors. And I think candidly at the time, I wasn't really even thinking about what I needed from a financial perspective to get things off the ground. So I think as you start building a business, you realize the constraints that you have and the things that you need in order to be successful. Very quickly, you end up at a place which is like, okay, well, I can do as much as I can do on a day-to-day basis, but ultimately we need to grow the team in order to be successful. And I think that was the first sort of sign on the horizon that said, okay, well, we need more. We need more to be able to move more quickly, and more at that point was cash. So from there, you start having conversations with investors. You start making a lot of mistakes. You don't understand the way that world works. You don't understand the way that people speak about raising money. And from there, I probably had, call it at least 100 conversations, but probably closer to 200 conversations where all the mistakes that I think Scottish founders in particular make, we made and we learned from. So every pitch was incrementally better than the last. The business is obviously improving alongside all those conversations. But eventually you get to a point where you can speak about the business in sophisticated enough terms, and You sort of understand the games that investors are playing. You understand the verbiage that they want to hear. You understand the mechanics and mechanisms of what you should raise certain rounds on. And you get to a point where you can have that sort of adult conversation where you don't seem like you don't know anything. Ultimately, in that business, we actually weren't able to raise any capital beyond probably an initial 60 or 75,000 that let us hire our first couple of people. And we were getting towards the end of our runway with that cash. And like you're touching on about the remote stuff, we were building that first business remotely. And we started to see all the challenges and obstacles around building remote teams. We cared a lot about hiring the most talented people in the world. We didn't think spending the money that we did have on office space was a good use of funds. And also, we wanted to see our kids grow up. So we start hiring people remotely. We start running into a bunch of challenges there. Long story short, we realized that's the business we should be building. We pivot to Firstbase. And I think all the lessons that we had from that fintech business with regards to raising money obviously stood us in much better stead when we started having conversations with investors when we pivoted. And we just had a lot more traction in that business. So as we pushed out of the landing page, we saw a lot of inbound from people who were interested in what we were building. I was writing a lot online at the time about sort of building remotely, the opportunities, the benefits. And yeah, we got to a point where there was a lot of inbound interest, and the leverage or the proof points that gave us with investors let us really move quite quickly in raising a couple of $1 million seed round. We obviously raised a much bigger Series A from Andreessen Horowitz, and our Series B a year or so later.
Yeah, and so looking back to that experience, if you can cast your mind back, what was the one thing that you wish somebody had told you about the investment process that you think could have saved you either time or money or pain at that point when you were going through that process?
I think it's definitely pain and time, right? Those are the two most time, certainly the most important thing that any founder has. And you don't just spend days or weeks or months. Like, this was literally an 18 to 24 month journey to go from zero to being at least dangerous in those conversations. I think for me, there were a couple of books that really simplified that process in my mind. There's a book called Venture Deals by Brad Feld, which really breaks down the sort of legalese of term sheets and the things that you should focus on. So there's things around liquidation preferences, who gets paid first if there's a deal, maintaining control of the business. Obviously, you start to add board members. And there's another book called The Secrets of Sand Hill Road by Scott Kapoor, who's the general, I think he's general counsel at Andreessen Horowitz. So those two things were kind of like, this is like opening the curtain to me, if you will, where I could start to understand, like, well, this is actually how this world works. I wish I had probably encountered those two books 2 years earlier. And I think Scott's hadn't even been written at the time, so that might be a little bit of retrospective, reimagining what actually happened. There were also a couple of conversations I had with some people who had raised a lot of money in the past. Nigel Eccles at FanDuel was particularly important for me, and I think that was mostly on like how you can pull together a compelling narrative from really like a deck standpoint, and using that to get foot in the door. So I still didn't have a network per se where I could get introductions to investors. So a lot of my outreach was still cold. And the deck is a tool to get those conversations. I just never really appreciated up front.
Yeah. And like, were there specific challenges that you faced when you were seeking those funding rounds, apart from obviously the battle of time and the number of the sheer volume of conversations that you had to be having? Are there like, is there like a specific challenge that like stands out to you that you had to overcome?
I think the specific challenge up front was always one of geographic location. So I think if you're in Scotland, you're speaking to Scottish investors, and I think the challenge there was always like, okay, you're probably a little bit too ambitious to build the business you're trying to build here. Like, what? Explain to me why you, a person from Scotland, is going to be the person to build this business. Like, surely someone in Silicon Valley is going to do it. And for me, it was kind of like, maybe, but like, I think I'll work harder than anyone else, and like, if you don't believe me, I'll just go to the States and I'll do it from there instead. And I think ultimately that's what came to pass. We frankly couldn't raise money in Scotland. We couldn't raise money in the UK, and I think we were always extremely ambitious. We never had a real desire to build a nice sort of local business. Not that there's any issue with that, but we thought there was a real opportunity to go out and build a global tech business from on day one. And I think as you start to have those conversations with investors who have seen that before, it becomes much easier to have those conversations with someone that wants to support you. And I think the difference in those conversations, you speak to people in Scotland or at that time, the UK, I think London's changed a little bit since then. The conversation always begins from the perspective of, okay, this is interesting, but how do we mitigate the downside? And the downside is almost every startup fails. So there's very little mitigation that you can do. And I think the way that you defeat that is that you're even more ambitious, right? The more ambitious you are, I think the less competition there is. And then when you think about the component parts that are needed in order to build a huge business, people gravitate towards really ambitious people, right? People want purpose from their day-to-day lives, and work that comes from like really pursuing gnarly, difficult challenges. So when we went over to the States, we started having those types of conversations with people. It just starts off from a very different place, which is like, okay, we believe this is possible. Now, assuming that's true, how big can it be? And I think then you're immediately sort of on the same side of the table with the people who want to support you, and you're looking at ways to build a much bigger business versus saying, well, actually, like we could mitigate the downside by only launching in one region, like all this bullshit that then comes off the back of that.
I guess any founder out there would want to know, how did you connect with those US investors? Was that from your sheer outreach? Was it from introductions from people? How did you get in that room at that table?
Yeah, I think the sort of broad advice that's certainly out there is warm introductions are better than than reaching out cold. And I mean, honestly, I don't have much experience of either of those things. I don't have much experience of the latter. We never raised any capital from anyone that we ever got an introduction to. Every person we ever raised from was me either reaching out cold or investors reaching out to us cold. So I think that whole trope around like you need to get people to introduce you, like it's to me that kind of feels like it comes from a place of like gatekeeping, where if you don't know someone that can get you in the door, then you're not going to get in the door. And I think the way that like the things that people there's certain pattern matching there, right? If you get an introduction from someone who they've already invested in, they're going to put more credence in that than someone that comes in the door. So I subscribe to that belief. That being said, I think there's something in breaking the rules and standing out and being able to cut through the noise. And I think for me, and I think this applies for any startup founder, like there are certain things that you are or you need to be world class at. And I think fortunately or unfortunately for me, like I'm not the best speaker in the world, but I'm a very good writer. And when I can write a very sharp email that grabs the attention of some of the leading investors in the world, like I'm going to lean into doing that a lot more.
Yeah.
And that skill set for me let us do that. We could get in the door of these investors. I think getting in the door and then getting to investment is a different thing.
I mean, that's no mean feat in itself, writing an email that can grab an investor's attention, because they're getting hundreds of those emails, people trying to grab their attention every day. So,
yeah.
you know, the skill set that you must have to be able to pique that interest is actually not something to be sort of brushed over. That is a very important key skill.
I think that's true. I think for me, it was, yeah, I do have this skill. I'm good at these things. So I'm going to lean into that versus like, how do I find someone that can introduce me to this? Like, that just felt like that would take much more time. And yeah, I think that proved to be the case. And then I think as you go down that and you say, okay, well, what was in the emails or how do you write these things in a way that can catch the attention?
Yeah.
I think what you're looking for is an understanding of the world they live in a way that you can tell them a story that speaks to their motivations. So if you think about building a business, right, like what and when we speak about Firstbase, like what is Firstbase in its simplest essence? Like we help companies get set up. Not that interesting, right? Like it doesn't sound that ambitious. But when you start to like expand that, like what's the ultimate vision? What's the long-term goal? What's the traction that we have? And even early on, like we did have, I think, a decent amount of traction, which makes it a lot easier. You think about the ammunition that you have to write those cold emails, like traction's probably the most important piece.
Yeah.
But if you can write an email that's like Firstbase, we're building an all-in-one single platform to equip any team globally, and our traction is we have had 15,000 companies, including 50 of the Fortune 500, sign up in the last 3 weeks. We've 3x revenue in the last month and a half. Like I think it doesn't matter where you come from. If you have traction points like that, you're
Yeah.
going to be able to speak to the right people. So traction's obviously, I think, the most important part.
What do you think were the key things that stood out to US VCs when you spoke to them? Like, when did you see them having like an aha moment in their eyes that they're like, oh, right, this is actually a massive game changer. This is something I'm really interested in.
Yeah, I think there's certainly something to be said for tailwinds in the venture capital world. And I think fortunately for us, like we started building a business predicated on the trends going towards remote working before COVID hit. And then
Great
COVID
timing.
hits. Yeah, we're better to be lucky than good, I guess. And I think as that happens, like there's obviously a much larger focus on that from the people who are looking to invest in whatever the current thing is. And COVID made distributed working the current thing. And I think when you look behind the numbers, like obviously remote work had grown a lot from like 2008 to 2018. It had, I think, 4x decade over decade. So the trends were there, but it was still very early. And then you have this generational moment that accelerates the bet we were making by 10 or 15 years overnight. And it brings forward all this demand. So I guess that's to say, like, timing matters, tailwinds matter, traction as a consequence of that matters as well. And I think the confluence of all those things at the same time, where it was like we had traction pre-COVID, the world was going more remote. If you looked at the data, distributed working's clearly been happening for the last 20 years. You looked at the technology trends, you had distributed technology, you have super fast internet almost all around the world. You have people who don't want to live in big cities, who still want to work for the best companies in the world. And all those things together said, okay, well, there's going to be a company that emerges from this. The other question that then comes on top of that is like, well, who's the right person to pursue it? So I think for us, like as people sort of clicked in on our story, we had a lot of things in our backgrounds that I think suggested we were the best people in the world to deliver that product. And I think coming from Scotland, working in the oil and gas industry, like I had been setting up people all around the world for like 10 years before distributed working even became a thing. And I think those data points all together said, okay, well, there's an interesting bet to be made on Firstbase.
Yeah. So you know a lot of a lot of fellow founders, other people running their own businesses, potentially ones that are looking for investment themselves. What kind of common mistakes do you see other founders making when they're seeking investment, and how do you think that they can avoid those curveballs?
I think most founders complicate things too much. So like the most common thing I see looking at a deck is me not being able to come away with what the business actually is in reading 15 slides. I'm like, okay, there's probably something interesting here, but you're just not giving me the essence and simplicity of what we're trying to achieve here. And I think again, it's like taking what you have, distilling it down into its simplest form, and then like multiplying it by 1,000x ambition. So you think about the motivations of humans overall, like what they want is to live longer and be happier. And ultimately there needs to be some purpose for any business tied to that, right? Like, are you enriching the human experience? Are you stopping people dying? Are you helping people live longer? Those types of things. And then I think it's just about breaking that down in ways that identify, well, what is the market we're attacking? What are the types of customers we're pursuing? What does the product actually do? Get really detailed on what the problem actually is and the solutions that are coming after it. Yeah. And then I think some founders are pretty bad at looking objectively about the progress that they've made and picking out the right proof points. So I think if you're to think like, we have X number of clients and they're paying us Y, I think there's like, most founders will just group that together, but like one of those metrics might be more important, which is like we have all this traction with all these companies and we're not charging them enough money today, but they're certainly paying us. So there's a proof point there. And yeah, I think just getting much better on understanding like what is the traction and proof points that people want to read, pulling out the pertinent information and just making it really easy for people to understand as they read through a deck. Like there's got to be a story.
And I guess you're just turning off an investor if they go through a deck and they still at the end of it can't answer the question, what is it that you actually do? Why could this business be a unicorn? Like what is it what is it changing in the world?
Yeah, and I think those are like the red flags that you need to avoid, right? Imagine it's a 15 slide deck. You should be able to click through that 15 slide deck in 3 minutes and just get the whole story of the company, where it is, where it's going,
Yeah.
the people in it, the traction. And I think like that there's something in that as well, right? Where it's like in early on in businesses, investors don't have much to go on. So what they're looking at are what are the patterns here? And how few red flags are there? And is this founder someone I would invest in, irrespective of what the business problem they're trying to solve is? And like, sure, there's an element of like, does the founder fit the problem? Like founder market fit, I think, is a thing. But I think at the same time, they're looking at like, how few red flags are there? Because that's going to be the amount that I need to pay to educate this founder and bring them up to speed. And if there's too much, I'll just back a different founder in the space.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that you don't think that I disagree with you, by the way, but you think that you don't think that one of your strong points is like speaking publicly and things like that. But what about sort of like the marketing and business development side of things? How important has in the process of engaging with investors, how important is that whole business development and marketing piece? Because, investor marketing is a thing, it's something that I work on with businesses. So like how much of that whole process involved marketing and business development from your perspective as a founder?
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you take like a look over the last 10 or 15 years, I think business brand is in some ways being replaced by founder brand. And like, I think if you look at Elon, like clearly he has been the leading light in this. But if you look at trends, I think if you look at what Mark Zuckerberg's doing just now, you look at what Mark Benioff's done since really 1997 and the books and things that he's pushed out. Yeah, and then and you look at people like Emily Glossier, like the same thing sort of played out over and over again, where increasingly founders of B2B businesses, some of them are B2C, are able to leverage their personal brand to drive attention towards the business that they're building. I'm not a marketer to the extent I'm going to be able to dig into the customer acquisition cost, like breakdown of why the benefits of founder-led type things of that nature are really important. But anecdotally, I think that's got to be true, right? You've got a founder who can stand there and be a figurehead for a movement. The general interest in that company is going to be much higher than a company which doesn't have that.
100%. And like even the algorithm is sort of like created to reward that. Like business founders will get at least 5 times more reach than any company LinkedIn post will get.
Yeah.
So it's people care about people and they want to it's all human to human marketing at the end of the day, and people want to like, know and trust somebody before they do business with them, and that's just the way it's kind of always been, really.
I think that's spot on, yeah, and I think there's something to be said for like the added credibility that a human gets in putting across a message versus the company, right?
Yeah.
Rightly or wrongly, any message a company puts out is going to be seen as salesy, and I think if it's coming from a human, you can at least invest in like, okay, this person is trustworthy, he or she's interesting, they've done things in the past which I've thought are pretty cool. You don't really get that from a brand to the same extent, or you do, but it's much later. So you think about someone like Airbnb, like that's taken years of investment.
Yeah, so that brings me really nicely onto LinkedIn. So, I mean, you have 76,000 followers on LinkedIn now, and 15,000 people subscribe to your Against the Herd newsletter. So did those followers come before or after the investment? And how much has that LinkedIn presence helped the investment process?
It came before and after. So there was certainly a lot of interest, like post the pandemic happening, remote work rising. And I think there was a lot of interesting opportunities that came as a consequence of that. So I guess maybe going all the way back to the start, right? I think a very conscious decision I made at the outset was I need a public presence in order to break through because I'm not an insider, right? And I think when you think about the things that insiders have, like they have access already, they have the ears of people who matter. And I think the thing I believe, and I guess continue to believe, is that if you aren't in the right geographic locations, you better be in the right technological locations. So Twitter, LinkedIn, it was certainly Twitter earliest. So there were a few of our investors probably came across me on Twitter even before Firstbase.
Mm-hmm.
And like a lot early on was just about growing the audience. So like I probably went from like 1,000 people on Twitter to 5,000 people, and like just the boost that you get from more eyeballs on your stuff at that time. I think the algorithm on Twitter has changed, but like the difference between 1,000 and 5,000, like you're tweeting stuff at 500 to 1,000 people, nobody's listening. You tweet stuff at 5,000, and like almost always there's going to be something that blows up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So start on Twitter, start to see the same stuff on LinkedIn. I think if you're building a B2B business and you're not on LinkedIn today, like you're leaving a lot of money on the table very unwisely. And then obviously as you start to get the added credibility of you raise money, you close more customers, you raise more money, you close a lot more interesting, bigger logos. People gravitate towards that because the things that you're saying should matter more than if someone's saying who doesn't have that type of credibility, I guess.
Yeah. And if anyone is watching this today and is not already following Chris, then you must go and do that today.
Yeah, I don't know. I got, and don't judge me on my social media output would be my bag.
So you mentioned a couple of books that you like really find beneficial at the beginning of the investment process, or that you wish that you'd read earlier in the investment process. But what are sort of like the basic things that a founder should have in place in their business before starting their investment journey? You know, things like a pitch deck, a one pager, a clean cap table. You mentioned that to me before, and I would like to sort of like pick into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think maybe starting with the last piece, I think certainly from a Scottish standpoint, if we look at the investment ecosystem here, the challenge we have is that we just don't have that many founders that have been through the type of journey where the experiences they have are valuable to the people who need them. And you can count on probably two hands the number of people that have built really significant tech companies here. Like obviously there's Skyscanner. You think about Current Health, there's obviously FanDuel, there might be Free Agent, there's probably 5 or 6 others that you could name.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very limited range of people that have the experience that is helpful for the founders that are in Scotland and then probably more broadly in the UK. And I think because of that, we end up in a situation where the people writing angel type checks don't understand how they need to invest in order to make a company successful. And I think certainly from a Scottish standpoint, we are a very frugal nation. And I think that sort of permeates the psychology of we want to invest at the lowest price for the maximum ownership. And where you end up there is with a lot of companies that end up raising 50 to 100K who end up losing, selling, giving up, whichever phrase you want to use, 30 to 50% of their business. And the problem with that isn't that they didn't need the cash, it's that they've given up too much of their business where they've essentially killed it. And painfully along the way, they will then build a business. They'll get to a point where they have enough traction to speak to later stage investors. The investors will be sufficiently impressed with the business that they'll start to dig in on due diligence. And then at some point, they'll see the cap table and they'll basically say, who is person X? Why do they own 30% of the business? And that just kicks off a whole sort of series of events, which makes it incredibly difficult for them to invest. And sure, you can push back and say, well, they invested earlier, I gave up this, and like, blah, blah, blah. But the investor is going to eventually get to a point where they're like, okay, but why am I going to give you $2 million for 15 to 25% of the business when person X, who has no experience, is adding no value, got 30 to 50% of the business for 50 to 100K? And there's just no way out of that, right? And for me, like I have way too many of those conversations with founders who nobody else has told them that, because nobody in the Scottish ecosystem necessarily knows that. The second problem, I think, is in how we raise that money. So I think everyone defaults to, we should do a priced round. Price rounds are expensive. You need lawyers. So you should raise it on a YC safe, simple agreement for future equity, where you do the price round later. And like all those types of things. So those are, I think, things and experiences that we don't necessarily have in Scotland. We also give up board seats to people that shouldn't have board seats. So the question then becomes like, okay, well, there's a lot of naivety in this company. And going back to the red flags question we had, the red flag thing we had earlier, like those red flags start to add up, and the investor's like, okay, this is too much effort for me to write a check. And then maybe the third thing would be sort of the reverse of the first one, which is like someone has too much ownership. Oftentimes the early team has too little ownership. So you think about the founding team, you think about co-founders. Investors will often say like, okay, you've got a technical co-founder who only owns 3% of the business. That's not right. They need to own 15% to be appropriately incentivized to stick around for the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And again, these are all things where like, if you've never been through it, you're just never going to know these things.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit about the sort of mental side of things, the emotional side of things of pitching to investors. Firstly, are you pitching to investors, or are investors pitching to you? How do you approach that mentally? Is it a meeting of minds, or is somebody pitching to somebody else?
I think it's always much easier to raise investment when you don't need money. And not needing money can come in a number of different forms. It can be, we're not raising yet. It can be, we don't need the money because we're cash flow positive.
Yeah.
It can be any other variant of those things. And I think if you're an investor, like the companies you want to invest in most are the ones who don't need your money. So there, the opportunity you should take is just get to know investors over a longer period of time. I think there's a lot of instances where people try to run really efficient processes, and what they sacrifice there is the opportunity to really get to know the people who, if the business is successful, they're going to be part of the journey for the next 10 years. And I think trying to get to know someone where, like, imagine you've met a partner for the first time and like you're trying to get them to marry you on the first date. Like it's a very intense thing, and like it's probably not like conducive to building the strongest relationship. So like for me, it's always been, I want to get to know the partner over a long period of time, and that's months, not days or weeks. And at some point, like it might make sense for us to mutually get on this journey together or not, right? We might discover we're not the right fit.
Yeah.
The other thing, and this again, painful lesson for me over a long period of time, investors also don't like desperate founders, and I think in the sort of guise that often comes across as is like, please buy a part of my business. We really need it to be successful. Investors want to invest in businesses that would be successful regardless of whether they take their money or not. And I think the sort of mindset shift there needs to be that like you believe you can build a really big business. So the person funding that business isn't the lucky one, or is the lucky one, sorry, because they get the opportunity to own part of your creation and get the upside that's going to come as a consequence of it. And I think that's like, it's a subtle thing, but actually really important in how you portray and talk about what you've built.
Where does sort of generating FOMO fit into that perspective then? Because obviously when investors are interested, they want to know that there are other investors also interested, that creating that sort of fear of missing out sort of thing. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's hard, right? Because I don't think you can artificially manufacture that, but I think you can run a process by which it happens more naturally versus not.
Yeah.
So I think first off, like the biggest FOMO you can build is like just build a great business, full stop, right? Without building a great business, it's hard to generate the level of interest that you're going to need to raise around. So number one, build a great business. Number two, show that business in the right way. and show it in a way that shows the momentum that's going on, right? There's more week over week interest, there's better month over month interest. And the way that I showed that, again, because I think I'm a decent writer, I would write really strong investor updates really consistently. And I would keep people up to date, right? Here's the progress that we made from last month to this month. This is what we're going to do this month. And then every next month, I would sort of reflect on, I said I was going to do this. We actually beat that. We missed here. Here's our plan to overcome that the next time. So like what you're doing is you're showing them that you could build the business. You're showing them progress. You're showing them momentum. And then when you get into that around the conversations with investors, there's obviously a benefit to talking to a lot of people at the same time. So have a long list of people that you send that to, have a decent length list of people that you're keeping up to date live on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And then as you start to show progress, I think what you start to see is people gravitate to that. And rather than going out and saying, hey, I need $2 million to build a business, ultimately you want to be in a place where people are proactively offering you money rather than you're actively raising it. And I think that's, I don't know, again, nuanced. I think not the reality for a lot of startups, but I think most startups can get a lot better at the front things that sort of lead to the outcome of the latter.
Yeah, the demonstration of momentum as opposed to the potentially inauthentic creating FOMO.
Yeah, I think it's hard for anyone to come and look at something in a vacuum and appreciate the progress that's been made. So there's definitely something to be said for like the consistency of progress leading to the momentum in the business where people are like, okay, there's an inflection point. Either it's already happened and I've seen a journey for long enough to feel like I can trust the founder to continue to lead on it.
Yeah. Just sticking with the emotional element of it, how do you think founders can avoid the feeling of disheartenment when they're getting negative feedback or tire kicking from potential investors? Because like you need to speak to so many people and not all of them are going to be massively enthusiastic about what you're trying to do. So how did you personally deal with that?
I think if you really struggle with that, you probably shouldn't be a founder. Like quite honestly, because there's going to be so much disappointment along the way. Like there's going to be times where you think you have product market fit. There's going to be times where you think you're going to hire the next greatest person. There's going to be clients you're trying to close, investors you want to give cash, and like the one common thread in every startup is that you're going to hear no 1,000x more frequently than you're going to hear yes. And if that's demotivating and like psychologically difficult, and you don't have like it's just not naturally in you to get over that, or it doesn't inspire you to push harder. I just don't know if there's a path past that, right? Like I think the piece around like you need to learn, enjoy the taste of your own blood in startups is absolutely true, right? Every day is like a fight for survival, and people that think startups or like this work-life balance, rosy, fun, exciting place every day are just in for such a rude awakening that it's like borderline unbelievable. And even if you look at all the stories of like the overnight success of like Facebook, probably the most famous example. But look at any startup, right? There's 10 years of pain, stress, strife, and struggle that really went into that. And it only really starts to work at the end, right? It's not like, and like, sure, there's peaks and troughs, and there's times where you get the enjoyment of it, but like it only really begins to work at the end where it's like, okay, we're not going to die today. And even then, I think every great founder is always in the position of delusionally believing that they'll be the one that's able to do this while also understanding the existential nature of their business, which is like, we're probably still going to die, but I'm going to keep going anyway.
That tiny light at the end of the tunnel that you just need a lot of resilience to get to.
Yeah, I mean, I think most founders are broken in a way that pursuit is somehow enjoyable. Yeah, I don't know.
Let's talk a little bit about so you've spoken to UK investors and you've spoken to US investors. What do you think are like, are there any specific cultural or operational differences when you're speaking to those? Is there like
Yeah.
different processes for due diligence? Like, what would you say that you would find the key comparisons between those two audiences, if you will?
Yeah, I think hard for me to comment on like any structural differences because we frankly haven't raised for any British investors. I think psychologically there is a difference, and I think the difference originates from a very simple thing, which is it's much easier to believe something's possible when you've seen it happen. Okay, so like you think about the US, you think about all the businesses that have grown from there. Like it's no surprise that in Silicon Valley, you're more likely to build a unicorn because there are a lot more unicorns there, right? There's this dense mass of talent and belief and ambition that drives the next generation forward because they can look over their shoulder in a coffee shop and there's the founder of $1 billion business sitting there taking a meeting with an investor or giving advice to founders or writing angel investment checks into companies. So I think like to me that's the main difference. You look at the UK, the EU. There are just not enough founders that have done it, right? And like I think it increases year over year. You think like every year you can add a new unicorn that lists to that list. Like you think about UiPath or Spotify, or you look at what Revolut's doing, or you think about DeepMind and their exit to Google. So it happens, but it's just happening really, really slowly in Scotland to an even lower degree. And then I think like the second order effects of that are that because you have a lot of people writing checks that might have already made it economically, they are able to take more risk, right? So risk is now the sort of capital that they can invest because they've earned the right to. And I think in Europe, like that risk appetite isn't there to the same degree. So, like I was saying up front, like there's always this question of like, well, how do we mitigate downside? If it doesn't fail, like what's the worst outcome that can happen? Like, how do we make sure this doesn't go to zero? I think when you're speaking to American investors, they're almost always saying, how big can this be if it's successful? Can we throw more petrol on the fire to accelerate that future more quickly? And I think maybe the thing that most people don't appreciate with venture capital is that it's an accelerant positively and negatively. It's an accelerant positively because it should get you to a much later destination earlier. It might also kill your business much quicker. It might also kill your business when your business shouldn't have died because it shouldn't have raised that money in the first place. And I think that's a trade-off that maybe people in Europe aren't like they don't realize they're fortunate for in a way, right? Like if they don't have that choice so much, there are more constraints on them. And I think sometimes constraints are good. So raising less capital can be good. It being harder to raise capital can be good. But I think belief from your investors is actually a really positive thing.
Yeah. And so when you were speaking to them, how important for them was it that you had a base in the US and a presence in the US, or were they just as happy engaging with you remotely, given that your whole business rests on the world of remote work?
Yeah, I think naturally you have to be a believer in the distributed future of work to believe in our business. Otherwise, like I don't know if you could make that bet, so to speak. I think most investors probably don't care about where anyone is anymore. I think there are certain advantages to certain businesses being certain places. But certainly for our investors, like it wasn't that important where we were. That being said, like I think the one thing American investors do prefer is where the top level company is located. So like the one thing not to take risks on, and the thing they understand most is like the business structure. So like if you're going to build a business and at any point you're going to try and raise money, probably makes most sense for it to be a Delaware C corp in the US versus any other type of business. And I think the UK is okay. I think if you go into places like Germany where it's GmbHs and things got really complicated, and like again, red flag for investors, they would rather do what they know, and Delaware C corps are really easy. So that was one advantage I think we had.
You mentioned that like when an investor is going through a deck, they're just looking for how many red flags are there here that, will either put me off this or that I should be concerned about. What do you think is like the killer thing that they're looking for, like the one thing that really, really piques their interest? I think you've talked quite a lot about sort of like demonstrating the momentum of the business, showing that you have a founder that can be trusted, showing that you have a team there. But what's the like, okay, this is exciting. Is it,
Mm.
right now, buzzword? Is it AI? Is it is there something that investors are really
Yeah.
looking for right now in a deck, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's certainly an element of human psychology in whatever the current thing is. Like if it's there, it becomes much easier to believe that this business has tailwinds, rightly or wrongly, right? And like whether you're an AI business or not, if you're doing any element of ML, like right now, you probably benefit from calling it AI.
Mm,
I think, and the data is probably much easier. I think DocSend has great data on how much time an investor spends on each page of a deck. I might be off, but I'll be directionally right, which is like they spend 30 seconds per page and like overall about 3 minutes on a deck. Um, so I think that's the bar, right? Like that's what you're up against is you have a very limited amount of attention on your thing.
mm,
And you better be able to put across the most impactful things as quickly as possible. Because if you don't, they're not going to come back and take a second look. And if you don't, they're not going to reply to your email about taking a live meeting. So I think in a deck, like the challenge isn't to sell the business. The challenge is to get the next meeting or get the progress. And there's obviously a bunch of data that comes behind it. You have to have financials if the business is later stage. But the deck is a marketing tool to get a second meeting or get a first meeting. And then for me, it's like, okay, well, you have 10 to 15 slides. The slides can be whatever they want, but you better have a really simple title that conveys what that slide is, or they're not going to look at the detail of the slide, right? Like, how much can you read in 30 seconds? 15 words, maybe 30 words, 40 words. But like
mm.
have less words, interesting pictures, numbers, graphics, like the things that you like to read and look at. Same thing investors like to look at. So you just need to make something that gets a second meeting or
It's
first
the
meeting.
ultimate first impression, isn't it?
It is. And I think it's like it's a test in a way, right? Do you know your business well enough that you can tell the story in as few words as possible?
And I wanted to ask you, how important do you think storytelling is?
Um, I think the best story almost always wins in startups.
Yeah. And I think also just having the ability to be able to tell the story as well, like bring people on a journey, is important for a founder too. Okay, I'm on to my last question, Chris. You're almost done with
Let's
being
go.
grilled. And I'm sure that lots of founders who are at this stage of the business thinking about investment, trying to have those conversations, will have found so many of your tips so valuable today. So thank you so much for sparing the time for no benefit to you whatsoever, apart from just, spreading the good word, imparting your wisdom to others. But I really want to ask you about what you think the future trends in remote work are, since obviously that is your thought leadership theme after all.
Yeah.
Where do you think this world of remote work is going, and what do you think investors are going to be interested in as well?
Yeah, so I think like the distinction between different locations of work has like I think that war's been won largely. I think there are still stories out there about companies trying to push people to return to the office. I'm not convinced that's playing out the way that most companies are sharing, and I think in many ways it's actually been a tool to reduce headcount without having to pay severance. So I think that's but it seems obvious to me that that's what's happening. I think it's less obvious to the people that are writing the stories about it. I think companies will continue to be more distributed because talent is universal. Like if you want to be the best company in the world, you better be able to hire the best people in the world. And the best people don't generally want to live in one location, nor do they want the same life experiences that come from being in that place.
Mm-hmm.
I think to go back to your buzzword, like I think AI will change things. I think if you think about what one human is capable of doing, it should increase, productivity should go up, but humans will just find more things to do with their time. So I don't think there's any panacea coming of 4-day or 3-day work weeks, like I think the amount of time worked will probably remain pretty steady. I think there are a lot of interesting workflows that can be automated when you think about building broader and deeper business systems. So I think over the course of the next 3 to 5 years, there'll be compounding companies. You think about the bundling that happens in different technologies, like Netflix was a good example of that, like bundling different video companies. I think the same thing will happen with software. So you think about the last 20 years of SaaS, the direction of travel there has really been very niche businesses or ever more niche businesses catering to ever more niche audiences. And the real benefit of AI comes from having really broad, unniche platforms. So I think when I think about all the big business system platforms, like there's probably a convergence there where everyone starts to push towards the same area, which is owning more customer data, having more surface area of product. I think software probably gets easier to build over the next 20 years so the moat of software disappears. And I think there'll be a lot more service-based components to businesses. So it'll be software and services, where the moat the business is building is in the service piece. And it'll be really broad platforms that can automate end-to-end across companies. So you think about HR, finance, IT, engineering, operations. Each of them today work in their own platforms, which means that they have very siloed data, which means communication, like cross-functionally, is the challenge. If you have broader platforms that AI can connect the dots, like you should be able to eradicate a lot of that problem. And I think there's somebody coined the phrase like the collaboration tax that distributed work places on top of it. I think that's absolutely right. I think it is harder in many ways for distributed companies to operate. And I do wonder if AI becomes that connective tissue that makes it much easier again. So I don't know, that's quite meandering, and I don't know if it's specific enough to answer the question, but
I just look
those are
forward to
things I'm
seeing
thinking
if
about.
your predictions are correct.
Yeah, probably not, but there may be elements that ring true, I guess.
Listen, thank you so much for your time today. I hope other founders find this really helpful, and I really appreciate, and I also learned a lot, and I find it really fascinating, and I look forward to seeing your business and you go from strength to strength from now on.
Thanks, Michelle. Good to see you again.
Okay, speak to you later.